Ambassador Real Vashton had not wanted the Earth posting. Nobody in the Veriti Compact's diplomatic corps had wanted it, which was precisely why it had fallen to him, the newest full ambassador in the service, 34 years old by human reckoning, with a spotless record and no powerful family connections to spare him an assignment everyone else had quietly maneuvered to avoid. 3 years, his supervisor had told him on the day the posting was confirmed, with the particular brisk cheerfulness people used when delivering news they knew was unwelcome. Observe, report, maintain cordial relations. The humans are a curiosity, Ambassador. Recently spacefaring, minor economic significance, no meaningful military footprint beyond their own system. It will be a quiet 3 years. Think of it as time to read. Rel had believed him, mostly, because there had been no particular reason not to. The Veriti Compact was old and vast, its territory spanning 11 systems and its diplomatic reach extending across dozens more, and in the grand accounting of galactic significance, a single-system species barely 2 generations into interstellar travel registered as little more than a footnote, worth a courteous embassy, a trade attaché, and periodic reports back to the Compact's Ministry of External Affairs, nothing more. He arrived on Earth in the autumn of his 2nd year of full ambassadorial service, landing at a modest diplomatic complex outside a city called Geneva that human officials had chosen, he was told, specifically because of its long tradition of hosting exactly this kind of delicate, low-stakes diplomatic work. The city did not look like a place capable of anything he would come to associate with the word brutal. It was quiet, orderly, ringed by mountains that turned gold in the autumn light, and the humans who greeted him at the embassy gates were, without exception, scrupulously, almost disarmingly polite. Ambassador Vashton, said the woman who would become, over the following 2 years, something closer to a friend than Rel had ever expected to find on an alien world, a human diplomat named Amara Osei, tall and unhurried in her manner, with the particular calm of someone who had spent a career learning that most problems were better solved slowly than quickly. Welcome to Earth. I hope your posting is a comfortable one. I am told it will be quiet, Rel said, testing the human phrase for courteous small talk that his linguistic training had prepared him with. Something flickered across Amara's face, not quite amusement, not quite something else. I hope so too, she said. Quiet is usually better, for everyone. He would remember that exchange, much later, with a clarity that felt almost unbearable in hindsight. The embassy complex itself occupied a modest campus on the outskirts of the city, a cluster of low, glass-walled buildings that human architects had designed, Rel was told, specifically to evoke a sense of transparency and openness, a deliberate choice, Amara explained during his first week, meant to signal something about how humanity wanted its diplomatic relationships to feel, regardless of how formal or guarded the actual negotiations conducted within those walls might become. He spent his first weeks doing what every newly posted ambassador did, learning the shape of a place through its small, unremarkable details rather than its official briefings. He learned which human foods agreed with a Veriti digestive system and which did not, after one memorably unpleasant afternoon involving a dish called curry that had left him confined to his quarters for the better part of 2 days. He learned the particular cadence of human weather, the way autumn gave way to a winter considerably colder than anything his homeworld's temperate climate had prepared him for, and the strange, quiet beauty of snow settling over the mountains beyond the embassy windows, a phenomenon his species had no direct equivalent for and that he found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, genuinely moved by the first time he witnessed it. He learned, too, the particular rhythms of human diplomatic culture, a blend of scrupulous formality in official settings and startling directness in private ones, a combination that took him the better part of 3 months to stop finding disorienting. Where Veriti diplomatic tradition favored layered indirection, statements crafted to carry multiple simultaneous meanings depending on how a listener chose to interpret them, human diplomats, at least the ones he came to know at the Geneva embassy, tended toward a bluntness that read, at first, as almost undiplomatic, until he came to understand it as its own kind of careful courtesy, a preference for saying difficult things plainly rather than allowing ambiguity to fester into later misunderstanding. "We used to be much worse at this," Amara told him once, during one of their early conversations, when he'd remarked on the directness of a trade negotiation he'd observed that morning. "Historically, I mean. Diplomatic doublespeak, saying one thing while meaning another, letting ambiguity do the work honesty should have done. It cost us, more than once, more than it should have. I think that's part of why we've swung so hard the other direction. We'd rather risk an uncomfortable conversation now than a catastrophic misunderstanding later." Rel had filed that observation away, at the time, as an interesting cultural footnote, worth mentioning in a quarterly report but not otherwise remarkable. It would be nearly 2 years before he understood it as one of the most important things anyone had told him during the whole of his posting. The first 18 months passed exactly as Rel's supervisor had predicted, quiet, uneventful, occasionally tedious in the particular way diplomatic work often was, filled with trade negotiations over agricultural licensing and cultural exchange programs and the slow, patient work of translating not just language but assumption between two species who had, until recently, had no reason to consider each other's existence at all. Rel found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he liked it. He liked Amara Osei's dry humor and her habit of bringing him small, thoughtful gifts from human regions she'd traveled to, a particular tea from a place called Kyoto, a book of poetry translated imperfectly but earnestly into Veriti script by a human linguist who had clearly worked very hard on a project nobody had asked her to complete. He liked the particular restless energy of human cities, the way they seemed to be perpetually building and rebuilding themselves, never quite satisfied with what they already had. He liked, most of all, the strange, unhurried honesty of the humans he came to know, a bluntness that had startled him at first, coming from a diplomatic culture built on centuries of careful indirection, but that he grew, over those 18 months, to find almost restful. He filed his quarterly reports back to the Ministry of External Affairs dutifully, describing a species that struck him as fundamentally reasonable, occasionally impulsive, deeply curious, and, this was the word he used most often, and the word that would come to feel, in retrospect, most inadequate, young. Humanity felt young to him, in the way a species still discovering the shape of its own place in a much larger universe often did, eager, a little defensive, prone to overcorrecting for insecurities Rel suspected they didn't fully realize they were carrying. What he did not report, because he did not yet understand its significance himself, was the particular quality of stillness that occasionally surfaced beneath that youthful energy, a watchfulness, in certain conversations, that felt older and more careful than anything else about them. He noticed it most in Amara, during the rare moments when their conversations wandered toward humanity's own history, brief, clipped references to conflicts on their homeworld that she never elaborated on, a certain tightness around her eyes when the subject of war came up even abstractly, and a habit, which he found himself unconsciously mirroring over time, of changing the subject rather than dwelling on it. "You don't like discussing your species' wars," he observed once, over the Kyoto tea she'd brought him, some 10 months into his posting. Amara considered the observation for a long moment before answering. "We don't like remembering how many of them there were," she finally said. "Or how long it took us to stop having them with each other. It's not a comfortable history, Ambassador. Most of us would rather talk about anything else." "But you did stop," Rel said. "Having them with each other." "Eventually," Amara said. "It took longer than it should have. And I think most of us are still a little afraid of how easily it could start again, if we let ourselves forget what it cost the first time." She paused, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I don't say that to trouble you, Ambassador. I say it because I think it's useful for you to understand. We don't fear conflict because we're unfamiliar with it. We fear it because we know exactly what it looks like, up close, when it's allowed to run its course." He did not fully understand what she meant by that until much later. By then, understanding it no longer mattered nearly as much as living through the proof of it. There were other moments, scattered across those 18 months, that Rel would later return to with the same uneasy recognition. Small conversations that had seemed, at the time, like nothing more than the ordinary texture of a developing friendship, but that revealed, in hindsight, a species he had fundamentally misjudged in ways his careful quarterly reports had never quite managed to capture. He remembered a dinner, perhaps a year into his posting, hosted by a mid-level human trade official named Daniel Okafor, at which the conversation had drifted, as human conversations often did after a few glasses of wine, toward speculative questions about the wider galaxy, what other species were like, what dangers might exist beyond the borders of explored space, whether humanity's remarkably peaceful first contacts to date represented the norm or an unusual stretch of good fortune. "Do you think we've been lucky?" Daniel had asked him, with the particular loose candor of a pleasant evening among colleagues who had, by that point, largely stopped thinking of each other as representatives of separate species and started thinking of each other simply as people who enjoyed each other's company. "Every contact we've made so far has been civil. Trade delegations, cultural exchanges, the occasional minor dispute that got sorted out through the usual channels. It makes you wonder if we've just gotten fortunate, or if that's genuinely how most of the galaxy operates." Rel remembered choosing his words carefully, aware even then of a certain diplomatic obligation not to alarm his hosts unnecessarily. "The Compact has encountered species considerably less civil," he'd said. "I would not describe your experience so far as typical. I would describe it, perhaps, as evidence that most established powers have found it more efficient to test a new species' patience gradually than to provoke it directly and risk an unpredictable response." Daniel had laughed at that, not entirely without an edge. "That's a very diplomatic way of saying you're all watching to see how much you can get away with." Rel had not disagreed, because he'd had no honest grounds to. He thought of that exchange often, in the months that followed the crisis, and found himself wondering how differently the whole affair might have unfolded if his own ministry had taken Daniel's blunt, half-joking observation half as seriously as it deserved. He remembered, too, a considerably lighter afternoon, perhaps 8 months into his posting, when Amara had invited him to accompany her to a human sporting event, a football match, she'd called it, played between 2 local teams in a stadium that had struck him, on arrival, as almost absurdly large for what he understood to be a purely recreational contest. He had spent the first half of the match thoroughly confused by the rules, and the second half unexpectedly, genuinely delighted by the sheer, unguarded passion of the crowd around him, humans shouting, embracing strangers, groaning in collective disappointment, all with an intensity that seemed, to his initial diplomatic sensibilities, almost alarmingly undisciplined for a species he had been briefed to consider reserved and businesslike in its public conduct. "You looked terrified for most of that," Amara had told him afterward, laughing, as they walked out through the departing crowd. "I was reassessing several assumptions," Rel had admitted. "Your species is considerably less restrained in public than my briefing materials suggested." "We contain multitudes, Ambassador," Amara had said, still smiling. "Most of what your briefing materials probably focused on was our diplomatic and commercial conduct, the parts of us we present most carefully to outsiders. There's quite a lot more underneath that, if you're willing to look for it." He had thought of that comment often, in the months after the crisis, recognizing in it something he wished his own ministry had taken considerably more seriously, that the careful, measured face humanity presented in formal diplomatic settings was, by Amara's own admission, only ever a fraction of what actually lay beneath it, a fraction that had left the Compact's analysts dangerously unprepared for the fuller picture that eventually, catastrophically, revealed itself. The trouble, when it began far from Earth entirely. A border skirmish between a Veriti Compact patrol fleet and an unaligned mining consortium operating in a disputed system 3 transit weeks from Seoul, a conflict that had, on paper, absolutely nothing to do with humanity. Rel learned the details only gradually, in the careful, filtered way diplomatic staff always learned about military matters. Fragments in briefing summaries, offhand references in secure communications from the ministry, the particular tightening of tone in official correspondence that experienced diplomats learned to read as a sign that something larger was unfolding behind the scenes. What he eventually pieced together was this: the mining consortium involved in the dispute, a loose coalition operating outside any formal compact jurisdiction, had recently begun contracting human vessels for cargo escort and logistics support, a purely commercial arrangement, as far as anyone on Earth's side seemed to understand it, unconnected to any broader political alliance. When the Compact's patrol fleet moved to assert jurisdiction over the disputed system, several of those contracted human vessels had been caught in the resulting engagement. The Compact's official report, which Rel received through standard diplomatic channels roughly 2 weeks after the incident, described the engagement in the careful, bloodless language military reports always used. Unauthorized vessels operating in contested space were engaged per standard interdiction protocol. Incidental damage to third-party contractors was regrettable but consistent with the established rules of engagement for unaligned commercial assets in a declared exclusion zone. Rel read that phrase, incidental damage to third-party contractors, several times before he fully understood what it meant. Human ships had been destroyed. Human crews had died in a conflict that had nothing to do with them, caught in the crossfire of a jurisdictional dispute they had no stake in, because a Fleet Commander 3 transit weeks from Earth had decided that commercial vessels operating under contract to an unaligned consortium did not merit the caution normally extended to a recognized third party. He requested clarification from the ministry immediately, using every diplomatic channel available to him. The response, when it finally came 4 days later, was brief, and carried the particular bureaucratic coolness of an institution that considered the matter already closed. The engagement was conducted within established rules of engagement. Human vessels operating without proper compact registration accepted commercial risk consistent with unaligned status. The ministry does not anticipate this incident requiring further diplomatic attention. Rel sat with that response for a long time in his quarters that evening, reading it over, and felt, for the first time in his career, a genuine and unfamiliar unease. He spent that evening doing something he rarely allowed himself the indulgence of, reviewing the full technical specifications of the incident, rather than the sanitized summary the ministry's report had provided. What he found, buried in the appended sensor logs the Compact's own patrol fleet had filed as a matter of routine record-keeping, unsettled him considerably more than the report's careful language had. The human vessels involved had not, as the official summary implied, blundered unwittingly into a declared exclusion zone. The sensor logs showed them transmitting standard identification and cargo manifests well before entering the disputed system, exactly as any properly registered commercial vessel would, and continuing to broadcast those identifiers throughout the engagement. A detail the Compact Patrol Commander's own after-action report acknowledged receiving and choosing to disregard, on the grounds that the vessel's registration with an unaligned consortium rather than directly with the Compact itself technically placed them outside the protections normally extended to recognized third parties. It was, Rel understood, reading through the technical appendices late into the night, a distinction that existed almost entirely on paper, a bureaucratic loophole exploited, whether deliberately or through simple carelessness, to justify treating clearly identified civilian and commercial vessels as legitimate targets. He found himself thinking of the 23 crew members who had died as a direct consequence of that loophole, and of how easily, how casually, an institution he had served his entire career could reduce their deaths to a footnote about registration technicalities. He requested a meeting with Amara Osei the following morning. She received him in a small, private meeting room at the Human Foreign Ministry, and Rel noticed immediately that her usual easy warmth had been replaced by something more careful, more contained, the particular controlled stillness he had come, over 18 months, to recognize as the expression she wore when something mattered more than her manner was letting on. "You've seen the casualty report," she said, before he'd even finished sitting down. "I have," Rel said. "I want you to know that I raised the matter with my ministry immediately, and that I consider the incident deeply regrettable." "I appreciate that, Ambassador," Amara said. "I want you to understand something, and I want you to understand it clearly, because I think it matters more than either of us may currently realize." She paused, choosing her next words with obvious care. 23 of our people died in that engagement. Contracted crew, not military personnel, escorting cargo they had every reasonable expectation of delivering safely, in a system your ministry's own jurisdiction claims were murky enough to require a formal dispute in the first place. Your government's response described that as incidental damage. "I did not draft that language," Rel said quietly. "And I do not endorse it." "I believe you," Amara said. "But you are not the one who needs to understand what I'm about to tell you, Ambassador. I like you. I consider you, genuinely, something close to a friend, after 18 months of this posting. I am telling you this because I would rather you hear it from me, plainly, than watch it unfold without any warning at all." She met his eyes directly. "My government does not consider this matter closed. And I want you to understand, as clearly as I am able to make you understand, that when my government determines that a matter is not closed, it does not resolve that determination through further diplomatic notes." "What does it resolve it through?" Rel asked, though some part of him already suspected the answer would be one he did not want to hear. Amara was quiet for a long moment, turning her own cup of tea slowly between her hands, and when she finally spoke, Her voice carried a weight that Rel had not heard from her before, the careful, deliberate tone of someone choosing to share something she had not been explicitly authorized to share, because she judged the cost of silence higher than the cost of the disclosure. "Do you know why we chose to build our defense doctrine the way we did, Ambassador? I don't mean the technical specifications. I couldn't discuss those with you even if I understood them fully myself. I mean the philosophy behind it. When we first began seriously discussing what an interstellar defense posture should look like, there was a real debate, a contentious one, about whether we should announce our capabilities openly, the way some species do, as a form of deterrence through visibility. We decided against it. We decided, instead, that our defense should remain understated for as long as possible, precisely so that any power foolish enough to test us would test us based on an inaccurate picture of what they were actually risking. It was not a decision made out of modesty, Ambassador. It was a decision made out of the belief that a threat clearly seen is a threat that can be planned around, and a threat that arrives without adequate warning is a threat that ends conflicts quickly, with less total suffering on both sides than a prolonged, evenly matched engagement would produce. Rel absorbed that for a long moment. You are telling me that the two incidents that have already occurred were, in your government's assessment, sufficient grounds to abandon that restraint entirely. I am telling you, Amara said, that my government has spent 2 years watching your ministry treat our patients as evidence of limitation rather than choice. I am telling you that every additional incident makes the eventual response, whenever it comes, more difficult to calibrate carefully because patients allowed to run too long risks looking, in retrospect, like weakness that needed correcting rather than restraint that was simply, finally, exhausted. She paused. I would like nothing more than for your ministry to issue a formal apology, appropriate compensation to the families of the deceased, and a binding commitment to revise its rules of engagement regarding contracted third-party vessels. That is what I have recommended to my own government, in the strongest terms available to me. I do not know if it will be enough. I do not know if your ministry will even consider it seriously enough to try. Rel transmitted her words to the ministry that same evening, framed with every ounce of diplomatic urgency he could bring to bear. He received, 4 days later, a response nearly identical to the one before it. The matter was considered resolved under established protocol. Further diplomatic engagement was not currently deemed necessary. The ministry thanked Ambassador Vashton for his continued diligent service and looked forward to his next quarterly report. He read that response standing alone in his embassy office, and felt, for the first time in his career, something that was not quite fear but was uncomfortably close to it. 3 weeks later, a second incident occurred, smaller in scale, but in Rel's estimation, considerably more troubling in what it revealed about his own government's posture. A Veriti Compact survey vessel, mapping resource deposits in a system adjacent to human-claimed territory, had detected what its sensors flagged as an unregistered human research outpost operating without proper compact notification. Rather than following standard first contact protocol for an unregistered installation, a formal notice, a request for identification, a period allowed for response before any further action, the survey vessel's escort had conducted what the official incident report described as a precautionary boarding action, sending an armed party directly onto the outpost without warning, citing concerns about unregistered activity in a system the Compact considered within its resource assessment purview. The outpost, it turned out, was a small, entirely civilian climate research station, staffed by 11 human scientists studying atmospheric conditions on an uninhabited moon nobody had previously shown. any interest in claiming. No weapons were found. No violation of any established treaty was substantiated. The boarding party withdrew after 4 hours, having caused, according to the human government's own formal complaint, considerable damage to sensitive research equipment and what the complaint described, in carefully measured but unmistakably furious language, as significant psychological distress to civilian personnel who were held at weapons point for an activity that constituted, at most, a minor registration oversight. REL requested an emergency meeting with the ministry's regional director, the highest-ranking official he had any hope of reaching directly, and made his case as forcefully as diplomatic protocol permitted. Director, with respect, I have now watched 2 separate incidents unfold in the span of 5 weeks in which compact forces have applied disproportionate and, in my assessment, unnecessarily aggressive protocols against human civilian and commercial interests. I have spent 18 months embedded with this species, and I am telling you, as clearly as I am able, that they are not a people who will simply absorb this pattern indefinitely without response. Ambassador, the director said, with the particular weary patience senior officials reserved for junior colleagues they considered overly invested in a minor posting. I understand your concern. But you must understand the broader context. Human territory sits adjacent to several disputed resource zones the Compact has strategic interest in developing. A firm posture now, while the relationship is still young, establishes useful precedent for how future disputes will be resolved. I would remind you that humanity possesses no meaningful fleet presence beyond its own system, no significant alliance network, and a level of military technology our own assessments place at least 2 full generations behind current Compact standards. There is very little they can meaningfully do in response beyond diplomatic protest, which, while regrettable, the ministry is prepared to absorb. Director, REL said, and he could hear, even as he said it, the particular note of desperation entering his own voice. I am not asking you to fear their fleet. I am asking you to consider that a species capable of building what they have built in barely 2 generations of spacefaring history may have capacities your assessments have not yet accounted for, and that continuing to test their patience on the assumption that they lack meaningful recourse is a wager I do not believe this ministry has adequately examined. Your concern is noted, Ambassador, the director said, in a tone that made unmistakably clear the conversation was over. I would encourage you to focus your energies on maintaining the embassy's cordial working relationship with the human government. That remains your primary function in this posting. REL tried, before ending the call, one final approach. Director, may I ask what specific intelligence underlies the ministry's confidence in human military limitations? I have spent 18 months embedded here, and I have seen nothing in that time that would justify the certainty with which this ministry continues to dismiss the possibility of meaningful retaliation. There was a pause on the line, brief but perceptible, before the director answered. The assessment derives from standard capability projections, Ambassador, based on observable infrastructure, registered fleet strength, and comparative technological benchmarking against known Compact standards. I am not at liberty to walk you through the full methodology. Forgive me, Director, REL said, but that is precisely my concern. Registered fleet strength assumes the fleet we can observe is the fleet that exists. I have lived among this species for 1.5 years, and if there is one consistent lesson I have drawn from that time, it is that humans do not consider it dishonest to keep private what they have not been explicitly asked to share, particularly when they have good reason to expect that sharing it would be used against them. I would ask, respectfully, whether this ministry's assessment has adequately accounted for that possibility, or whether it has simply assumed that what we can see is the whole of what exists. The director's response, when it came, carried a faint but unmistakable edge of irritation. Your speculation is noted, Ambassador, though I would remind you that speculation, however thoughtfully framed, remains speculation. The ministry deals in verified intelligence, not diplomatic instinct. I trust you will continue to focus your reporting accordingly. Rel ended the call and sat alone in his office for a long time afterward, staring at nothing in particular, turning over Amara's words from weeks earlier. I would like nothing more than for your ministry to issue a formal apology. I do not know if it will be enough. He began, that evening, keeping a private record of everything he observed, not for any official purpose, but because some instinct he couldn't fully name told him it would matter later, and that he would want, when it did matter, to have an honest account of exactly how this had unfolded. Amara requested a meeting with him one final time, 6 weeks after the second incident, and Rel knew, the moment he saw her face, that whatever she had come to tell him would be the last conversation of its kind they would have for a very long time, if ever. They met not at the foreign ministry this time, but at a small cafe near the embassy district, a place they had visited together perhaps a dozen times over 18 months of an increasingly genuine friendship neither of them had expected their respective postings to produce. She looked tired, Rel thought, in a way he had not seen before, not physically exhausted, but carrying some heavier, more internal weight. I wanted to tell you this in person, she said, without preamble, once they were seated. Not through official channels. As myself, to you, because I think you've been honest with me throughout this posting, and I owe you the same honesty now. Tell me, Rel said. My government has exhausted its diplomatic options, Amara said. We formally requested an apology and compensation for the casualties in the first incident, and a binding revision to compact rules of engagement regarding human commercial and civilian assets. That request was declined 6 days ago, in language your ministry apparently considers appropriately final. We requested, separately, a formal accounting of the second incident and disciplinary action against the personnel responsible for the unlawful boarding. That request was also declined. Rel felt something cold settle in his chest. What happens now? Amara was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight he had never heard from her before, not anger, not triumph, but something closer to grief, delivered in advance for something that hadn't yet happened. I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, Ambassador, because I am about to do something that may cost me my career, and I am doing it because I consider you a friend, and because I do not want you present on this planet when what comes next arrives. I want you to leave. Tonight, if you can arrange it. Tomorrow at the very latest. I cannot tell you specifically what is coming. I do not know all the details myself, and even the parts one do know, I am not authorized to share. But I am telling you, as plainly as I am permitted to tell you anything, my government has decided that diplomacy has been exhausted, and it does not intend to repeat that request a third time. Whatever comes next will not look like the 2 incidents that preceded it. Please. Go home. Rel stared at her, the weight of what she was telling him settling slowly, incompletely, into something he could barely process. Amara, he said, I have an obligation to report this to my ministry. I know, she said. I expect you to. I am not asking you to betray your government, Ambassador. I am asking you, as a friend, to protect yourself. Whatever you choose to report, and whenever you choose to report it, please make sure you are not still standing on this planet when it matters." He transmitted an emergency report to the ministry that same night, relaying everything Amara had told him, framed with every possible degree of urgency his diplomatic authority allowed. He requested immediate authorization to evacuate the embassy staff as a precautionary measure. The response, when it finally arrived 9 hours later, 9 hours that Rel spent awake, watching the message queue, unable to sleep, was the last communication he would ever receive from the Ministry of External Affairs in its current form. Request denied. Embassy staff will maintain standard posting per protocol. Ambassador Vashton is reminded that alarmist reporting based on unverified diplomatic hearsay does not meet the ministry's standards for actionable intelligence. This matter will be addressed through appropriate channels. He read it 3 times, and then he did the only thing he could think to do. He began, quietly, without authorization, making his own preparations to evacuate the embassy's most essential staff, on his own authority, whether the ministry sanctioned it or not. He was 3 days too late. Rel would return, often in the months and years that followed, to the memory of that final ordinary evening, the last night before the word soul response entered the vocabulary of an entire galaxy, when he still believed, despite everything Amara had told him, that some last-minute diplomatic intervention might yet avert whatever was coming. He had spent that evening at the embassy's small residential wing, drafting a follow-up communication to the ministry, more urgent in tone than his previous attempts, though he suspected, even as he wrote it, that urgency alone would not be sufficient to move an institution so thoroughly committed to its own miscalculation. He remembered the particular quality of the city outside his window that night, ordinary, unremarkable, humans going about the mundane business of their lives with no evident awareness that anything unusual was unfolding, restaurants filling with evening diners. Traffic moving in its familiar patterns along the streets beyond the embassy gates. He remembered, too, a brief, unexpected visit from Daniel Okafor, the trade official who had once asked him, over wine, whether humanity had simply been lucky in its contacts so far. Daniel had come to the embassy that evening on some minor pretext related to an ongoing agricultural licensing negotiation, though Rel suspected, in hindsight, that the pretext had been largely manufactured, an excuse to check on him, offered in the particular indirect way humans sometimes extended concern without naming it directly. "You look like you haven't slept," Daniel had observed, settling uninvited into the chair across from Rel's desk. "I have had a great deal on my mind," Rel admitted. Daniel had studied him for a long moment, something careful and searching in his expression. "Whatever's coming, Ambassador, and I think we both know something is coming, even if neither of us is supposed to say so out loud. I want you to know that not everyone here sees you as simply a representative of the government that's about to be on the receiving end of it. Some of us have gotten to know you as a person over the last year and a half. That doesn't change with whatever happens next." Rel had not known, in that moment, how to properly respond to the kindness of the statement, coming as it did on the eve of something he still could not fully bring himself to believe was actually imminent. "Thank you, Daniel," he'd finally said. "I hope, sincerely, that this proves to be an overabundance of caution on everyone's part." Daniel's expression had not offered much reassurance. "So do I," he'd said. "But I've learned, over the years, not to bet against my own government's follow-through once it's decided something is necessary. I'd get some sleep if I were you, Ambassador. Tomorrow's likely to be a long day." It had been, Rel reflected later, an extraordinary act of quiet decency, a human official, representing a government about to unleash something unprecedented, taking the time on the eve of it to make sure a foreign diplomat from the government it was about to strike did not feel entirely alone. He thought of that gesture often in the difficult months that followed, and came to understand it as its own small, important piece of evidence for everything Amara had tried to tell him about who humanity actually was, beneath the terrible thing they were about to do. He had, in fact, not slept that night, despite Daniel's advice. He had sat awake instead, reviewing his own private log, adding entry after entry, trying to capture in writing everything he had observed and everything he feared, driven by an instinct he still could not fully articulate that some record of honest, unfiltered observation would matter, later, more than any official report ever could. He had been drafting the final entry of that long night's writing when the first communication failures began the following morning, and he would return to that entry many times in the months afterward, struck by how ordinary and unremarkable it seemed in hindsight, how little it anticipated the scale of what was actually about to unfold. "I do not know what tomorrow holds," he had written, in the last line before exhaustion finally overtook him near dawn. "I hope only that whatever comes, it comes swiftly, and that it ends the cycle of escalation rather than beginning a longer, crueler one. I have grown, against every expectation of this posting, to genuinely admire this species. I hope, whatever else happens, that admiration survives what follows." The first sign that something had changed came not from any dramatic announcement but from the quiet, gradual failure of communication. Rel had grown accustomed, over 18 months, to the steady rhythm of secure transmissions between the Geneva Embassy and the Compact's regional relay station, routine daily check-ins, weekly diplomatic pouches, the ordinary administrative traffic of an embassy going about its business. On the morning of what would come to be known, in the fragmentary histories written afterward, as the first day of the Soul response, that rhythm simply stopped. He noticed it first as a minor technical inconvenience, a delayed transmission, unremarkable in itself, the kind of thing that happened occasionally due to relay congestion or minor equipment faults. By midday, when a second scheduled transmission failed to connect, and a third attempt returned nothing but an unresponsive relay signal, he understood, with a growing, sick certainty, that something considerably larger than a technical fault was underway. He attempted to reach the ministry directly through every backup channel available to him. Each attempt returned the same result: silence, or worse, the particular dead, unresponsive quality of a channel that was not merely disrupted but no longer existed at all. He turned, finally, to the embassy's own limited sensor array, modest equipment, intended primarily for weather monitoring and basic orbital tracking, never designed for anything resembling military intelligence gathering. What it showed him, over the following hours, was fragmentary and difficult to interpret with any certainty, but unmistakable in its broad shape. A pattern of unusual transit activity moving outward from Sol system at a rate and scale the embassy's civilian equipment had never been calibrated to track, vessels departing in numbers and configurations that bore no resemblance to anything in humanity's previously observed, modest orbital fleet. He did not know, in that moment, precisely what he was watching. He would not know the full scope of it for weeks, and even then, only in fragments, pieced together from what little information eventually reached him through channels that grew progressively less reliable as the following days unfolded. Some of what actually happened during those first hours would only reach Rel much later, compiled secondhand from surviving compact fleet logs that eventually made their way into the diplomatic archive. He was permitted, in his advisory capacity, to review fragments that painted a picture considerably more precise, and considerably more unsettling than the vague sensor traces he had watched scroll past on the embassy's civilian equipment. The forward command station nearest the disputed border, a modest but well-defended installation named Corvith Relay, had received no formal declaration, no ultimatum, nothing resembling the diplomatic theater that typically preceded any compact military engagement. Its final transmission, recovered later from a damaged backup data core and included, in redacted form, in the archive Rel reviewed, recorded a duty officer's increasingly urgent reports over a span of scarcely 11 minutes. Unidentified contacts, multiple, bearing from the outer system. Configuration does not match any registered human vessel class in our database. Contacts closing at a velocity inconsistent with any propulsion signature we have on file for this species. Requesting immediate confirmation from Fleet Command. Contacts have not responded to hail. Repeat, no response to hail. Recommend immediate. The transmission ended there, cut off mid-sentence. The relay station's final data burst arriving at Compact Command roughly 4 minutes before its own destruction was confirmed by a secondary listening post considerably further from the engagement zone. What followed, across the adjoining systems, unfolded with a speed that the surviving fragments of compact fleet communication described, almost without exception. In the same disbelieving register, forward shipyards struck before their defense grids could fully activate, supply convoys intercepted along routes that only existed in classified compact logistics records, command relay stations disabled with a precision that suggested, to the analysts who reviewed the wreckage afterward, detailed foreknowledge of infrastructure the compact had never shared with any outside power. Rel read those fragments, months later, with a mixture of professional detachment and private horror he found difficult to reconcile. He thought of Amara's words, "This was not an extermination, Ambassador, and I want you to understand that distinction clearly," and found himself, even amid the wreckage recorded in those logs, searching for and eventually finding the evidence of that distinction. Engagement after engagement in which compact vessels that transmitted surrender codes were allowed to disengage unharmed, in which civilian-adjacent infrastructure was conspicuously, deliberately avoided even when doing so appeared to complicate the tactical picture, in which the overwhelming, coordinated speed of the operation seemed calculated specifically to minimize the duration of the engagement, and therefore its total cost, rather than to maximize destruction for its own sake. It was, he came to understand, precisely the kind of restraint Amara had described, terrible in its scale, and yet unmistakably, deliberately bounded by choices that could have gone very differently had humanity wanted them to. He would not know any of this for weeks. In the moment, standing alone in the embassy's small operations room watching fragmentary civilian sensor data scroll across a screen never designed to display anything like what it was now attempting to show him, all he understood was that Amara Osei's warning had not been diplomatic hyperbole. It had been, if anything, understated. He tried to reach her directly, using every private channel their friendship had established over 18 months. The calls did not connect. He told himself this meant nothing beyond the general communications disruption already underway. He did not entirely believe himself. Over the following 11 days, Real Vashton remained at the Geneva embassy, not by choice exactly, but because he had, quite simply, nowhere else to go and no clear channel through which to arrange safe passage home even if he had. The ministry that might have authorized his evacuation no longer responded to any transmission. The relay networks that might have carried word of his situation to anyone in the wider compact had gone entirely, unnervingly silent. What information reached him came in scattered, unreliable pieces, human news broadcasts, translated imperfectly by embassy software never designed for the volume or urgency of what it was now processing, brief, guarded statements from human officials delivered with a controlled gravity that told him more through tone than through content, and, once, a visit from a junior human liaison officer he barely recognized, sent, apparently, on Amara's private instruction to confirm that the embassy staff remained safe and adequately provisioned, though the officer offered no further information beyond that narrow, careful mandate. "Is Ambassador Osei well?" Rel asked him, and the young officer's expression flickered with something Rel couldn't quite read before answering. "She's occupied with matters I'm not authorized to discuss, sir. She asked me to tell you, specifically, that she hasn't forgotten her promise to look after your safety, and that she'll speak with you directly as soon as she's able." It was 11 more days before that promise was fulfilled. In the meantime, Rel pieced together what fragments he could from the human broadcasts his systems managed to translate. The picture that emerged, incomplete and disjointed as it was, described something that exceeded anything his diplomatic training had prepared him to process, a coordinated response, launched simultaneously across multiple fronts, striking not merely at the specific compact fleet elements responsible for the two incidents that had precipitated the crisis, but at the broader military infrastructure supporting compact operations throughout the entire border region adjacent to human space, supply depots, forward shipyards, communication relay networks, command coordination centers, all struck within a compressed window of time that human broadcasts, with what struck Rel as an almost clinical restraint, described only as necessary and proportionate defensive action undertaken after the exhaustion of all diplomatic remedies. He watched, over those 11 days, human public sentiment coalesce around that action with a unity that unsettled him nearly as much as the action itself. Not the celebratory triumphalism he might have expected from a species suddenly demonstrating capability far beyond what anyone outside its own system had previously credited it with, but something quieter, heavier, closer to grim resolve. He watched interviews with human officials who spoke, without exception, in the careful, measured language of people who understood exactly what they had done and carried no illusions about its weight. He watched, once, a brief, unguarded moment of human grief, a memorial gathering for the crew lost in the original incident that had started everything, footage that ran only once before human broadcast networks, with what Rel recognized as deliberate restraint, chose not to repeat it. He noticed, too, the particular way human commentary avoided anything resembling celebration of the military action itself, even as it acknowledged, without evasion, the scale of what had occurred. One broadcast, which his systems managed to translate with reasonable fidelity on the 9th day, featured a lengthy panel discussion among retired military officers and academic historians, and Rel found himself listening to the entire segment twice, struck by the particular tenor of the conversation. Not triumphant, not defensive, but almost uncomfortably self-examining, as though the humans conducting the discussion were less interested in justifying what had happened than in soberly cataloging its cost, for their own sake as much as for any external audience. "We should be careful," one of the panelists said, an older woman identified only as a retired fleet strategist, "about letting this become a story we tell ourselves with too much pride. What happened was necessary, by every measure I can construct, given what preceded it. It was also enormous, and enormously costly, in ways I don't think most of us watching from home fully appreciate yet. I would rather we spend the coming years asking hard questions about whether it could have been avoided than congratulating ourselves on how effectively we executed it. Rel had transcribed that quote into his private log verbatim, recognizing in it something he suspected his own ministry, even in the depths of its current institutional shock, had not yet begun to properly grapple with. A species capable of overwhelming force that remained, even in the immediate aftermath of using it, more troubled by the necessity than proud of the execution. He remembered, too, sitting alone in the embassy's small kitchen on the 7th day, unable to sleep, watching a considerably less formal broadcast, a late-evening call-in program on which ordinary citizens phoned to share their own reactions to the unfolding crisis, a format his diplomatic training had never quite prepared him to interpret, given how little the Compact's own state-controlled media resembled anything so unfiltered. He listened to voice after voice, some angry, some frightened, some simply grieving, and found himself struck most by a caller identified only as a retired schoolteacher, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "I don't want us to become people who celebrate this," she said, when the host asked for her reaction to the day's developments. "I understand why it happened. I even believe it was necessary, given everything that came before it. But I keep thinking about the families on the other side, the ones who didn't ask for any of this any more than our own people did. I hope, whatever else this accomplishes, that we remember to grieve for all of it, not just our own part of it." Rel had sat with that call for a long time afterward, turning it over in the quiet of the embassy kitchen, thinking of how thoroughly it contradicted every assumption his ministry's assessments had built about what a young, recently spacefaring species would do once it discovered the scale of its own capability. He had expected, insofar as he had allowed himself to imagine the worst outcomes at all, something closer to triumph, or vengeance, or the kind of unrestrained celebration a species newly proven powerful might reasonably indulge in. What he found instead, again and again, across dozens of fragments of broadcast and commentary, was a species turning its overwhelming victory into an occasion for sober self-examination rather than pride, grieving, even for its enemies, in a way that struck him as almost unbearably mature for a species barely 2 generations removed from its own homeworld. He understood, watching that footage, something he suspected his own ministry had never once properly considered in 18 months of dismissive assessments, that whatever humanity had built, in barely 2 generations of spacefaring history, had not been built for conquest, or glory, or any of the ambitions that typically drove younger species toward military development. It had been built, quite specifically, so that this grief, loss, the particular helpless fury of watching your own people die for reasons that felt arbitrary and unjust, would never again go unanswered. Amara came to him on the 12th day, arriving at the embassy in the early evening, alone, without the usual security detail or diplomatic formality that had accompanied every previous visit. She looked, Rel thought, considerably older than she had 6 weeks earlier, not in any physical sense, but in the particular way exhaustion and grief aged a person from the inside, regardless of how carefully they maintained their outward composure. "I'm sorry it took so long," she said, settling into the chair across from him in his small embassy office, the same office where he'd spent 11 sleepless days watching fragments of a war he barely understood unfold at a remove he found almost unbearable. "I wanted to come sooner. I wasn't able to." "Amara," Rel said, and found, to his own surprise, that his voice was unsteady in a way he hadn't expected. "What happened?" "I have seen fragments. I do not have anything resembling a clear account." She was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words with obvious, deliberate care. I'm going to tell you as much as I'm permitted to, Ambassador, which is more than I'd tell most representatives of your government right now, and considerably less than I suspect you deserve, given how honestly you've dealt with me throughout your posting. I understand, Rel said. After the second incident, Amara said, my government made a final formal request through the channels available to us. One last attempt, quieter than the others, made directly to your ministry's highest office rather than through the standard diplomatic queue, specifically to avoid the bureaucratic dismissal our previous requests had received. It was declined within 6 hours, in language that made unmistakably clear your ministry did not consider our concerns worth any further consideration. She paused. I want you to understand something, Ambassador, because I don't think your government ever properly understood it, and I don't want you to make the same mistake in whatever role you go on to hold after this. We are not a species that goes to war easily. We remember, better than most species I've studied, exactly what large-scale conflict costs, because we spent centuries doing it to each other before we finally, exhaustingly, learned to stop. When my government finally decided that diplomacy had been exhausted, it was not a decision made lightly, or quickly, or with any illusions about what it would cost on either side. What did it cost? Rel asked quietly. Amara's expression tightened, something raw and unguarded passing across it before she composed herself again. I am not authorized to give you exact figures, Ambassador, and I'm not certain the exact figures matter as much as you might think they do. What I can tell you is this: the response was directed, with as much precision as we were capable of achieving, specifically at the military infrastructure responsible for threatening this system and the border region around it. Civilian populations, wherever they could be identified and separated from military assets, were deliberately spared. Every fleet that surrendered, once the outcome was no longer meaningfully in doubt, was allowed to do so, and every surrendering crew was treated according to the same standards of conduct we hold ourselves to in any conflict. This was not an extermination, Ambassador. It was not intended as one, and I want you to understand that distinction clearly, because I suspect it is the distinction your ministry least expected and will find hardest to accept. She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried something quieter, more personal than the careful diplomatic language she'd used up to that point. I want to tell you something else, Ambassador, something I'm not certain I'm supposed to share, but that I think you deserve to hear, given everything else we've discussed over the past 18 months. I have a nephew. He served on one of the vessels involved in the initial response. He came home. Not everyone's nephew did, on either side of this, and I think that's the part of this I find hardest to sit with, that a conflict caused entirely by decisions made in rooms neither of us had any say in cost real people on both sides, people who had families waiting for them, people who had no part in the choices that put them in harm's way. I don't say that to excuse what my government did. I believe, still, that it was necessary, given everything that preceded it. I say it because I think it's important that you understand we don't view this as some abstract demonstration of strength. We view it as a cost we would have given almost anything to avoid paying, and that we are not eager, despite what the wider galaxy may now assume about us, to ever pay again. Rel absorbed that for a long moment, thinking of the 23 names he had never learned from a first incident that now felt, in the scope of everything that had followed, almost impossibly small. I am sorry, he finally said, for your nephew's service, and for everyone who did not return. I am sorry, too, that my own government's failures made this outcome, in your assessment, unavoidable. I do not say that as an official position of my ministry, Amara. I say it as myself. I know, Amara said. And for what it's worth, Ambassador, I believe you. And now? Rel asked. What happens now? Now, Amara said, the wider galaxy gets to decide what it makes of what it just witnessed. I don't know what that will look like, Ambassador. I don't think anyone does yet, including my own government. What I do know is that we did not do this because we wanted a war, or because we relished the opportunity to demonstrate what we were capable of. We did it because we were left, after every reasonable alternative had been exhausted, with a choice between accepting that our people could be killed without consequence, or making unmistakably clear that we would not accept that arrangement a third time. I am sorry it came to this. I mean that as sincerely as I have ever meant anything in 18 months of knowing you. Rel sat with her words for a long time, the small office quiet around them, the weight of everything he had witnessed over the preceding 11 days settling into something he suspected would take considerably longer than 11 more days to fully process. What happens to me now? He finally asked. To this embassy? I do not know if my government, in whatever form it now exists, still wants a diplomatic presence here at all. Amara looked at him for a long moment, something gentler entering her tired expression. That, she said, is rather up to you, Ambassador. But for what it's worth, and I recognize it may not be worth very much, given everything that's happened, I would very much like you to stay. The weeks that followed brought Rel, in fragments and increasingly reliable dispatches, a fuller understanding of exactly what had unfolded, and exactly what remained of the Veriti Compact's presence in the border region adjacent to human space. The military infrastructure that had supported the two incidents precipitating the crisis, along with the broader forward command network extending several systems deeper into contested territory, had been comprehensively dismantled, not merely defeated in the field, but rendered functionally inoperative, its supply lines severed, its command coordination shattered beyond any near-term prospect of reconstitution. The regional director who had dismissed Rel's warnings with such weary confidence had, according to fragmentary reports that eventually reached him, been among those captured when his command station was overrun, and remained, as far as Rel could determine, in human custody, awaiting a formal accounting process human authorities described, in careful diplomatic language, as consistent with established protocols for the treatment of surrendered military personnel. The Compact's Ministry of External Affairs, the institution that had employed Rel for the entirety of his career, that had dismissed his increasingly urgent warnings not once but 4 separate times, existed now in a state Rel could only describe, in the private log he still kept, as institutional shock. Its senior leadership scrambling to understand a defeat so swift and so comprehensive that no existing diplomatic or military framework had adequately prepared them to process it, let alone respond to it. He received, eventually, 3 weeks after Amara's visit, a formal communication from what remained of the ministry's regional office, considerably diminished in both authority and confidence, addressed to him not as a subordinate receiving instructions but, for the first time in his career, as something closer to an equal being consulted. Ambassador Vashton. In light of recent developments, the Ministry requests your continued presence at the Geneva Embassy in an expanded advisory capacity, given your unique first-hand experience with human diplomatic and cultural dynamics. Your prior warnings regarding the risks of continued escalation have been noted, belatedly, as having merited considerably more serious consideration than they received. The Ministry regrets the cost of that oversight, and requests your guidance in establishing a revised diplomatic framework going forward. Rel read the communication several times, turning over the strange, unfamiliar sensation of vindication arriving so completely stripped of any satisfaction. He thought of the 23 contracted crew members killed in the first incident, whose names he had never learned, and of how completely that first, seemingly minor loss had set in motion everything that followed. He thought of 11 sleepless days spent watching fragments of a war he had spent 18 months trying and failing to prevent, and of the particular, hollow ache of being proven right about something he had wanted, more than anything, to be wrong about. He thought, too, of the regional director's dismissive confidence during their final conversation. There is very little they can meaningfully do in response beyond diplomatic protest, which, while regrettable, the ministry is prepared to absorb, and felt no satisfaction whatsoever in recalling it, only a tired, aching sorrow for every life that particular confidence had ultimately cost, on both sides of a conflict that had never needed to happen at all. He spent several days considering how to respond to the ministry's request, weighing an offer he had once, in his most bitter private moments during those 11 sleepless days, imagined himself refusing outright, some part of him wanting, in the depths of that anger, to simply resign, to walk away from an institution that had cost so many lives through its own willful refusal to listen. But the anger, he found, in the quieter days that followed, had gradually given way to something more useful, a conviction that walking away now, when the ministry was finally, however belatedly, prepared to listen, would serve no one, not the families of the dead on either side, not whatever fragile diplomatic relationship might yet be salvaged from the wreckage, and certainly not the particular, hard-won understanding of humanity he had spent 2 years accumulating, an understanding that felt, increasingly, like something he had an obligation to put to use rather than abandon out of justified but ultimately unproductive resentment. He thought, most of all, of Amara Osei's tired, unguarded face, telling him, "I would very much like you to stay." He drafted his response to the ministry that evening, and it was considerably shorter than anything he had submitted in the whole of his previous career. "I will remain at the Geneva Embassy. I will serve in whatever advisory capacity the ministry requires. I would ask, in return, for one commitment, that future reports from this posting, however inconvenient their contents, be read with the seriousness they deserve, rather than the seriousness someone finds convenient. I do not believe this ministry can afford, ever again, to make the mistake it made with this one." What Rel came to understand, over the following months, was that the silence the wider galaxy fell into after the sole response was not, as he might once have assumed, the silence of a defeated or intimidated people cowed into submission. It was something considerably more complicated, and in its own way, more significant. Reports reached him, through the slowly reconstituting diplomatic channels of a compact still reeling from the scope of its miscalculation, describing a wave of quiet, urgent reassessment rippling outward across dozens of species who had, until recently, given humanity's existence barely a moment's consideration. Trade delegations that had once approached human space with the casual, faintly condescending confidence typically extended to minor, recently spacefaring powers now arrived with considerably more caution and considerably more respect. Military analysts across a dozen governments, Rel was told, had begun urgent, comprehensive reviews of their own assumptions about human capability, reviews that consistently arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion his own warnings had reached months earlier and been dismissed for offering. He was invited, some 4 months after the crisis, to address a closed session of the Compact's Ministry of External Affairs directly, an honor that would have been unthinkable for an ambassador of his rank and seniority under any previous circumstance, and one he accepted with a complicated mixture of vindication and grief he suspected he would carry for the remainder of his career. Before that address, Rel spent several weeks reviewing reports from compact embassies and trade missions posted across dozens of other systems, curious to understand how the wider galaxy, species with no direct stake in the Sol conflict, watching from a considerable remove, had processed what had happened. The reactions, he found, varied considerably in tone, but converged on a common thread of recalibration. A trade delegation posted among the Thren Ascendancy, a species Rel knew only by reputation as cautious and historically slow to revise established assessments, filed a report describing an unusually rapid internal review of the Ascendancy's own human relations policy, prompted directly by what their own military analysts described, in language the Thren delegation's report quoted verbatim, as a demonstration of coordinated precision strike capability exceeding several benchmarks previously assumed exclusive to significantly more established naval powers. A separate report, filed by a junior attaché posted among a loose coalition of independent trading consortiums along the galaxy's outer rim, described a considerably more anxious reaction, rumors spreading rapidly through informal trade channels, wildly exaggerating the scope of what had occurred, some accounts describing human capabilities that Rel, even with his own first-hand knowledge of the actual events, recognized as almost entirely fabricated. He found this particular report troubling in a different way than the others, evidence that in the absence of clear, verified information, fear tended to fill the gap with something considerably more distorted and dangerous than the truth itself would have produced. He raised this concern, eventually, in a private conversation with Amara, during one of the periodic meetings they continued to hold as the diplomatic relationship between their two governments slowly, carefully rebuilt itself. There is misinformation spreading, he told her, considerably exceeding the actual scope of what occurred. I worry it will do more damage, in the long run, than an accurate account would have. Amara considered this for a long moment. What would you suggest, Ambassador? I would suggest, Rel said, that your government consider releasing a more complete, verified account of the engagement. Not to minimize what happened, but to ensure the galaxy's understanding of it is grounded in fact rather than rumor. I believe an accurate account, properly presented, would serve your government's interests better than the exaggerated versions currently circulating, which risk provoking exactly the kind of reactive fear that leads other powers toward preemptive hostility rather than the cautious respect I believe your government actually wants to cultivate. Amara studied him for a long moment, something like genuine consideration in her expression. That is remarkably good advice, Ambassador, coming from a representative of the government we just fought a war with. I am no longer certain, Rel said, that I think of myself purely as a representative of that government in every respect. I have lived here for 2 years, Amara. I have watched what your people are capable of, both the terrible parts and the parts one have come, genuinely, to admire. I would rather see an accurate account of what happened reach the wider galaxy than watch fear and exaggeration do more damage than the truth ever could. His recommendation, relayed through official channels some weeks later, contributed, he was later told, to a decision within the human government to release a more detailed, carefully documented account of the engagement to select diplomatic partners, an account that, while still guarded in its specifics, was considerably more transparent than anything Rel had expected humanity to willingly share so soon after the conflict's conclusion. He took a quiet, private satisfaction in having played some small part in that decision, a satisfaction that felt, in the strange calculus of everything he had lived through, like the first genuinely constructive thing he had managed to contribute since his posting began. He was invited, some 4 months after the crisis, to address a closed session of the Compact's Ministry of External Affairs directly, an honor that would have been unthinkable for an ambassador of his rank and seniority under any previous circumstance, and one he accepted with a complicated mixture of vindication and grief he suspected he would carry for the remainder of his career. He stood before the assembled ministry officials, in a chamber considerably more subdued than any diplomatic gathering he had previously attended, and delivered, as plainly as he was able, the account he had spent 18 months, and 11 sleepless days, and 4 months of careful reflection since, coming to understand. "I do not believe humanity is a species that seeks conflict," he told them. "I have lived among them for the better part of 2 years. I have watched them build, and argue, and negotiate, and grieve, with a thoroughness and an honesty I have rarely encountered among species considerably older and more established than they are. What I have also come to understand, and what I believe this ministry failed to adequately account for in every assessment leading up to this crisis, is that they carry a memory, recent, unhealed, deeply internalized, of exactly what unchecked conflict costs, because they inflicted that cost upon themselves, repeatedly, for centuries, before finally, painfully, learning to stop. They do not fear war because they lack the capability to wage it. They fear it because they understand, better than almost any species I have encountered, precisely what it costs everyone involved. And when they finally, reluctantly, concluded that war had become unavoidable, they did not wage it carelessly. They waged it with a precision and a restraint that I believe should trouble this ministry considerably more than the raw scale of the destruction itself. A species capable of that degree of control, deployed only after every other option had been genuinely exhausted, is not a species this compact can afford to misjudge again." The chamber was silent for a long moment after he finished, the particular, weighted silence of an institution absorbing a lesson it had paid an enormous price to learn. "What would you have this ministry do, Ambassador?" the presiding official finally asked. "I would have this ministry treat every future interaction with human space," Rel said, "with the same seriousness it would extend to any established, senior galactic power, not out of fear, though I understand fear will likely play some role in that recalibration regardless of what I say, but out of genuine respect, freely given, for what they have built, and for the restraint they showed even in the moment of their greatest justified anger. I believe that respect, offered honestly rather than extracted through catastrophe, is the only foundation on which this compact can hope to build a relationship with humanity that does not eventually repeat the mistakes of the one we have just survived." A senior official near the back of the chamber, whom Rel recognized as a long-time member of the ministry's military liaison office, raised a hand and was recognized by the presiding officer. "Ambassador," the official said, his tone carrying a note of genuine, if belated, curiosity rather than the dismissiveness Rel had grown accustomed to over 18 months of largely unheeded reports. "You speak of their restraint with something approaching admiration. I confess I find that difficult to reconcile with the scale of the destruction inflicted. Can you help this council understand how you arrive at that characterization?" Rel considered the question carefully before answering, aware that his response would likely shape how this particular assessment was remembered within the ministry for years to come. "I understand the difficulty, Counselor. I struggled with the same reconciliation myself, in the weeks immediately following the crisis. What I have come to understand, through considerable review of both the human public record and the fragmentary military accounts our own surviving personnel have since provided, is that scale and restraint are not, in this instance, contradictory qualities. Humanity possessed, by every indication I have been able to gather, the capability to inflict considerably greater and more indiscriminate damage than it chose to inflict. It targeted, with a precision that our own intelligence services have struggled to fully explain, specifically the military infrastructure responsible for threatening it, while deliberately sparing civilian populations and accepting surrender wherever it was offered. I do not say this to diminish the genuine scale of what occurred, Counselor. I say it because I believe the distinction between a species that destroys everything within its reach and a species that destroys precisely what threatens it and stops is the single most important distinction this ministry can draw going forward. The former is a threat that must be permanently contained. The latter is a partner this compact can, with sufficient care and genuine goodwill, eventually learn to work alongside. The chamber absorbed this in a silence that felt, to Rel, different in character from the silence that had followed his initial remarks, less shocked, more genuinely reflective, as though the assembled officials were, for the first time in his experience with this institution, actually weighing his words rather than simply enduring them. 2 years later, Real Vashton stood once more in the small café near the Geneva Embassy district, waiting for Amara Osei, who arrived, as she often did now, a few minutes late, carrying 2 cups of the same tea she had first introduced him to on his second week on Earth, a lifetime and a war ago. She had been promoted, in the aftermath of the crisis, to a senior position within humanity's diplomatic corps. A recognition, Rel understood, not merely of her role in the events themselves, but of the particular skill she had shown throughout, the ability to hold both compassion and resolve simultaneously, without letting either one diminish the other. "You look tired," she said, settling across from him, sliding one of the cups toward him with the easy familiarity of 2 years of continued friendship that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, survived a war between their respective governments. "I have spent the morning drafting the final terms of the new trade framework," Rel said. "It is, I am pleased to report, considerably more equitable than anything my ministry would have proposed 3 years ago." "Progress," Amara said, with something that might, in a less exhausted context, have been a genuine smile. They sat together for a while in comfortable silence, watching the autumn light move across the mountains beyond the café window, the same light that had greeted Rel on his first day on this planet, when he had believed, with the particular confidence of a young diplomat who had not yet learned better, that his posting here would be quiet. "I had a message from Daniel last week," Rel said eventually. "He asked after you. He mentioned he's overseeing the reconstruction assistance program now for some of the border systems affected by the conflict." "He mentioned that to me as well," Amara said. "It's difficult work. Some of those systems weren't directly targeted, but they were caught in the disruption regardless, trade routes cut off, supply chains broken, populations that had nothing to do with any of this left to absorb consequences they never chose. I think that's part of why he took the assignment. He's always been better than most of us at remembering the people who get overlooked in the aftermath of something enormous." Rel nodded, thinking of Daniel's quiet visit on that last ordinary evening, an act of decency extended to a foreign diplomat on the eve of catastrophe. "He extended me a kindness once," Rel said, "that I do not think I have properly repaid." "I don't think Daniel does kindness expecting repayment," Amara said. That's rather the point of it. They sat for a while longer, and Rel found himself turning over a question he had been considering for some time, uncertain until this moment whether he had the standing or the right to ask it. "Do you think," he finally said, "that the Compact and humanity can build something lasting from this? Something better than the fear that seems to have settled over the wider galaxy in the aftermath?" Amara considered the question seriously, in the careful, unhurried way she considered most things that mattered to her. "I think it's possible," she said. "I don't think it's guaranteed. Fear is easy, Ambassador. It requires nothing from anyone except a willingness to keep their distance. Respect is harder. It requires both sides to keep showing up honestly, especially when it would be easier not to. I'd like to think that's what we're doing, you and I, in our own small way, every time we sit down at this table. I don't know if it's enough to shape what happens between our governments over the coming decades. But I don't know what else to do except keep trying. Do you ever think about it?" Rel asked eventually. "What happened? What it cost, on both sides?" Amara was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Every day," she said. "I don't think that ever entirely goes away, and I'm not certain it should. I think a species that stops thinking about what conflict costs is a species dangerously close to repeating it." Rel nodded slowly, turning his cup between his hands, thinking of a ministry that had, however belatedly, learned the same lesson at considerably greater expense than a simple habit of remembering would have required. He thought, too, of the private log he still kept, now filling a second volume, a record he had begun in fear and confusion and continued, in the years since, as something closer to a discipline, a deliberate practice of remembering, so that whatever came next, he would carry forward an honest account rather than a comfortable one. "I am glad," he finally said, "that I chose to stay." "So am I," Amara said. "Though I suspect, if I'm honest, I never doubted that you would." She looked at him for a moment longer, something warm and unguarded in her expression that reminded him, briefly, of the woman who had greeted him at the embassy gates on his very first day, before either of them had any idea what the following 2 years would ask of them. "For what it's worth, Ambassador," she added, "I think you've become rather good at this. Better, perhaps, than either of our governments deserves." "I have had an unusually thorough education," Rel said, "in what happens when patience finally runs out." Outside, the city continued its restless, perpetual work of building and rebuilding itself, unbothered by the particular weight of history the two of them carried between them, a species that had, when finally and genuinely provoked beyond the limits of its considerable patience, answered with a completeness that had silenced an entire galaxy's casual assumptions about what a young species could and could not do. And somewhere in that silence, Rel had come to understand, was not merely fear, though fear had certainly played its part. It was something closer to a lesson, hard-won and permanently learned, that the quietest, most patient people were very often the ones who understood best exactly how loud they could become, and precisely how much it would cost them to do so, and who chose, for as long as any reasonable alternative remained, not to. He raised his cup, a small, private gesture that had, over 2 years, become something like a ritual between them. "To the next quiet posting," he said, with the faint, dry humor he had learned, in no small part from Amara herself, to bring even to the heaviest of conversations. Amara laughed, a real laugh, the first genuinely unguarded one he'd heard from her in longer than he cared to count. "To the next quiet posting," she agreed. "Though I suspect, Ambassador, that after everything we've lived through, neither of us quite believes in those anymore." "No," Rel admitted. I do not suppose we do. The END.